I want to tell you about a man named Franklin. He did not contact me the way most people do. He did not write a letter or call on a Sunday afternoon or find a way to send a message through someone else. What happened was that a woman named Patricia, Franklin's daughter, 44 years old, a teacher in a town called Decatur, Georgia, had watched the channel and written to me about her father, and had asked, carefully and with obvious love for the man she was describing, whether I would be willing to speak with him. She said he had been diagnosed with cancer 8 months earlier. She said he was doing all right, meaning he was fighting, and the fighting was not over, but the outcome was uncertain in the way that these outcomes are always uncertain, which is completely. She said he had things he wanted to say, and she thought I might be someone he could say them to. She said one more thing in her message. She said, "My father is not afraid of dying. He told me that. What he is afraid of is dying as the man he has been, instead of the man he always meant to be. And I think he needs someone to hear the difference." I wrote back and said I would be honored to speak with him. We talked on a Thursday afternoon in September. Franklin was 72 years old. He had a voice that was quieter than I expected, not weakened exactly, but thoughtful, deliberate. The voice of a man choosing each word with the care of someone who has recently understood that words are finite and is spending them more carefully. He had prostate cancer, diagnosed in January, spread to a degree that it required difficult conversations with doctors and with himself. He was in treatment. He said the treatment was doing what it could. He said he had made his peace with the uncertainty, which he said was easier than people assumed and also harder than people assumed simultaneously in ways that were difficult to explain. I asked him what he wanted to talk about. He said, "I want to talk about what scared me, because it wasn't what I thought it would be." Franklin had grown up in Birmingham, Alabama, the son of a steelworker named James and a woman named Ruth, who had worked in a school cafeteria for 30 years, and who Franklin described, without hesitation, as the most genuinely good person he had ever known. Not saint good, he said, just good. A woman who had looked at the world and decided her portion of it was going to be handled with decency and warmth and without complaint, and who had done exactly that for 78 years until she died in 2019. He said he had given a eulogy at her funeral that he had written in one sitting because there was simply too much true material, and the problem had been selection rather than invention. He had studied accounting at Morehouse. He had built a 35-year career as a CPA and then a financial consultant, eventually running his own practice in Atlanta with 7 employees and a client base he had cultivated over decades with the same methodical attention his mother had given to her portion of the world. He had married a woman named Gloria in 1981. They had 2 children, Patricia, who had written to me, and a son named James, 41, named for Franklin's father, who worked in hospital administration in Charlotte. He had 6 grandchildren spread between his 2 children. He had been married to Gloria for 42 years and said, simply and without qualification, that she was the best decision he had ever made, and he had known it from the 2nd year of their marriage, which he said was the year you actually know, when the performance of early love settles into the actual person and you discover whether you have married someone you can live inside a real life with. He said the diagnosis had arrived on a Tuesday in January. He and Gloria had been in the doctor's office together. He said the doctor was a good man who delivered difficult information with appropriate care, and Franklin had listened and asked the questions a financial consultant asks. What are the numbers? What are the scenarios? What are the variables? What is the range of outcomes? He had taken notes on a yellow legal pad, which he still had, which he said was filled with figures and percentages written in his own handwriting that looked, reading back, like notes from a business meeting, and not like the record of the day he found out his life had an accelerated timeline. He had driven home from that appointment in the car with Gloria, who had cried in the quiet way that some women cry when they are trying to protect someone else. And he had held her hand across the center console and had felt, he said, something unexpected. He had felt calm, not numb, not dissociated, not performing calm for Gloria's benefit, genuinely calm, in the deep part of him where he could not have manufactured it if he tried. He said he had examined this calmness carefully in the weeks that followed, because it seemed like something worth understanding. What he had found, examining it, was this: he was not afraid of dying. He had grown up in a family where death was not hidden. His grandparents had died at home, tended by family, and he had been present for those deaths as a child and had absorbed, without being taught it explicitly, the understanding that dying was a part of living and not an aberration in it. His faith, he had been a member of the same Baptist church in Atlanta for 30 years and meant it, he said, in the way he meant all the things that mattered to him, which was quietly and completely. His faith told him something about what came after, and he believed it not as a performance of belief, but as a genuine orientation toward the unknown. He was not, he said, a man who had been running from death his whole life. He had known it was coming. He had factored it in. He was ready for it in the way a prepared man is ready for the thing he cannot prevent. What he had not been prepared for was the inventory. It arrived, he said, about 3 weeks after the diagnosis. He had been sitting in his study at 5 in the morning. He had been waking early since the diagnosis, his body rearranging its relationship with sleep, and he had not been praying or thinking in any organized way. He had simply been sitting with the specific quality of early morning silence and the particular awareness of a man who now understood concretely what he had always known abstractly, which was that the time was limited. And in that silence something had arrived that he could only describe as an accounting. Not a judgment, not a voice from outside, just the internal auditor of his own life, who had apparently been waiting for sufficient cause to issue a full report, presenting the findings. The findings were not what he expected. He had expected to think about the things he had done wrong, the failures, the mistakes, the moments where he had been less than he wished. He was a fair-minded man, and he had accumulated the normal quantity of those moments and had made his peace with most of them, and he expected the accounting to focus there. Instead, what arrived was an inventory of the things he had never done. Not things he had done wrong, things he had decided, over 67 years of living carefully and intentionally and responsibly, not to become. He had wanted to write. Not accounting, not professional writing. He had done enough of that for several lifetimes. He had wanted to write the way his mother had talked, which was with a kind of plain-spoken beauty that made ordinary things luminous. He had kept a journal from age 22 to 34, written in every day, filled with observations about the world and the people in it that his mother had told him he had a gift for. He had stopped in 1984 because he had 3 employees and Patricia had just been born, and he could no longer find the hour. He had told himself he would return to it when things settled. He had not written in a private journal since 1984, 39 years. The journals were in a box in the closet. He had not opened the box in decades. He had wanted to go to South Africa, not for any particular reason that he could justify to a spreadsheet. He had read about it in 1990, just after Mandela's release, and something had moved in him that he recognized as call, not obligation, not tourism, but the deep pull of a place that felt somehow relevant to the larger story he was living inside as a black man in America. He had said he would go when the children were older. He had said it again at 50, and 55, and 60. He was 72, and he had not gone. He had wanted to learn his maternal grandmother's recipes. She had died in 1991 and had taken with her the knowledge of how to make 7 dishes that Franklin could taste in memory with complete precision and could not reproduce. He had meant to learn them while she was alive and had not, and after she died he had thought about reconstructing them and had not done that either. And now they existed only in his memory and would die with him, which meant that some part of his grandmother's grandmother's grandmother would disappear from the world when Franklin went, quietly and without ceremony, the way most things disappear. He had wanted to tell Patricia something. He paused for a long time before telling me what it was. He said he had always been closer, in the way the world could see, to his son James. James was like him, methodical, financially minded, interested in systems. Their relationship had the ease of similarity. Patricia was like her mother in most ways, and like his mother Ruth in the ways that mattered most, which was the plain-spoken beauty, the ability to make ordinary things luminous. He had loved Patricia with a specific and enormous depth his whole life, and had expressed it consistently and genuinely. But he had never told her directly, in explicit words, the particular thing, that she was the one who had shown him what his mother had been trying to show him, about how to be in the world. That watching Patricia become who she was had been one of the central educations of his life. He had not said this because it had always seemed like something he would say at the right moment, and the right moment had not come in 44 years. And the accounting at 5 in the morning had informed him that this was because he had been waiting for a moment that he was going to have to create rather than receive. He said he had called Patricia the morning after that sleepless night. He had told her. He said he had been somewhat formal about it, which was his nature, and she had cried, which was hers, and he had been glad, deeply glad, that he had made the call. But he told me the calling had also made him see the distance between the thing said at last and the thing that could have been said for years and wasn't. He said Patricia had cried partly from being told and partly from the timing, from knowing why the timing was what it was. He said he did not want his grandchildren one day to receive the true version of how he felt about them only when the accounting forced it out of him. He wanted to say it now, in the ordinary time, when it could accumulate rather than arrive as a single late deposit. He said, "Here is what cancer taught me. Not about death, about living. I was not afraid of dying. I have never been afraid of dying. What I was afraid of, when I sat in that room at 5 in the morning and the accounting arrived, was dying as the partial version of myself, the version that had done the responsible things and deferred the true things, the version that had provided and protected and planned and never once sat down to finish what I started in that journal in 1984. He had started writing again. 3 weeks after the diagnosis, he had taken the box from the closet and opened it and read the journals, and had sat with the 22-year-old and the 29-year-old and the 34-year-old who had been paying attention and writing it down, and had felt the loss of those years, but also something else, something he said was harder to name: recognition. He was still the man who had written those pages. That man had not gone anywhere. He had simply been filed away while other things were handled. He was writing now, every morning. He said he did not know what it would become, and had decided that was not the question. The question was whether he would spend the time he had left being the partial version or the whole one. He had not yet gotten to South Africa. He was not sure he would. The treatment and the uncertainty made planning complicated. But he had told Gloria he wanted to go, And Gloria had looked at him the way Gloria apparently looked at him when he finally said a true thing, and had said, "Then we'll figure out how to go." He said they were figuring it out. The grandmother's recipes he was reconstructing from memory, with help from a cousin who had watched her cook. It was inexact and sometimes wrong, and occasionally arrived somewhere that was not the original, but was something new and also good. He said his mother would have found this approach correct. His mother had believed that the point was not preservation, but continuation. He said near the end of our conversation, "I am not a man who wastes time on self-pity. I want you to know that. I am not calling you from a dark room feeling sorry for myself. I am calling you from the kitchen table with the morning light coming in, and a cup of glorious coffee, and 30 pages of writing I did this week that are the truest things I have put on paper since 1984. I am calling you because I want someone to know that the cancer was not the hard part. The hard part was the inventory. The hard part was sitting with the honest accounting of a life and seeing where the partial version had been substituted for the whole one." He paused. He said, "And the other hard part is that the inventory does not require cancer. Anyone can do it. Anyone can sit down at 5 in the morning and ask themselves honestly what they have been deferring and why. The cancer just made me do it. And I want to say to whoever needs to hear it, you do not need the diagnosis to take the inventory. You can do it now, while there is still time to do something with what you find." He said he should let me go. He had writing to do. I told him I was grateful he had talked to me. He said, "Thank you for being someone Patricia could trust to receive her father." He hung up. I have thought about Franklin many times since September. I think about him at the kitchen table with the morning light and glorious coffee and 30 pages of the truest things. I think about the journals in the box, the 22-year-old who had been paying attention, waiting 39 years to be returned to. I think about Patricia crying for what she was told and for the timing of the telling. I think about the inventory. Not the cancer, the inventory. Because Franklin is right. You do not need the diagnosis. The 5 o'clock morning is available to anyone. The box with the journals in it is in the closet. The call to Patricia can be made today. The accounting does not require a Tuesday in January and a doctor's office and a yellow legal pad full of percentages. It only requires the willingness to sit in the silence long enough to hear what the silence has been trying to say. Franklin heard it. He is writing it down every morning in the light.